evening. The New Testament's a collection, of course, of 27 books written in the middle of the 1st century AD. We no longer have the original manuscripts, what one calls the autographs. Instead, we depend on copies or on copies of copies and so on. And for the 13 centuries before printing was invented, copies were made by hand from exemplars which were themselves handwritten copies. The scribes occasionally made mistakes. Those errors were incorporated, of course, into copies of later on manuscripts. And the issue here is that it's fairly easy for a message to be altered or lost by bad transmission. We've all played the game Chinese Whispers. A short message then is passed around a room from mouth to ear, and the message at the end is rather the same as the message at the start. And this effectively is one of the modern critical attacks on the Bible. These are popular books. I don't know if you can read it, but the one on the left was a New York Times bestseller, misquoting Jesus, subtitle, The Story Behind Who Changed the Bible and Why, written by someone who has reasonable scholarly credentials. So that it's a popular book. That one's written by a textual scholar who should know better, and they claim that the text of the New Testament has been corrupted by the copying process, and in those are fairly well read books. Like I said, one of them's a New York Times bestseller. They're backed up by some more scholarly works. They contain a muted version of the same idea, very much more muted because they have to produce evidence, whereas the other ones can make a popular case instead. Anyway, what they're doing is they're claiming that the content of the New Testament has been significantly altered by scribes with an agenda. And of course, these are read by people who are trained to be clergymen. Their ideas have become regular teaching in the mainstream churches. And if you read things like the Da Vinci Code, which about half the population of Britain has by now, and that's a reasonable estimate, then you'll come up across these ideas in it. And I certainly had to handle them in last year in a Bible exhibition when it was in Liverpool. So it's not something which is a completely theoretical academic study. This is a study that you can come across at any time. You might come across at the open air on Saturday when you're at it. Now, in fact, the text of the New Testament is effectively identical to that of the original autograph, and the transmission of that text doesn't just depend on multiple links. It isn't just one copy which was made from one copy which was made from one copy and so on. For 13 centuries, people copied back to very old manuscripts. There were lots of parallel copyings going on. We can compare one manuscript with another, and there are thousands of manuscripts and thousands of other witnesses as well, and the links go back a long way, and one can easily check up to find out what the text of the New Testament is actually like. Now, we can divide the witnesses to the New Testament into various different types. There are lots of examples of each type, and they're identified by a serial number. I'll show you how that works. So, the oldest witnesses, as it were, pretty well, are New Testament manuscripts written on papyrus. They're called papyri because they're written on papyrus, and they're identified by a number beginning with letter P, usually written in a black letter script like this one here. And that's a papyrus of the Gospel of John from the end of the 2nd century. It's written in the script. If you look at it, they're all sort of capital letters. It's called an unsealed script. Later on, the unsealed script was written on parchment. Basically, parchment existed from the very earliest time, but the church couldn't afford it. Parchment's made out of animal skins. You get a very good animal. You get an unblemished sheep. You kill it, and you perhaps get 5 sheets of parchment out of that. So you've got to kill a lot of sheep in order to get a complete Bible. And think how expensive sheep would have been then. Parchment is expensive stuff. It took a lot of preparation after that to make it. So the church couldn't afford parchment to start off with. It had to make do with papyrus. But later on, they're writing on parchment, and these are called unsealed manuscripts because they're written in this unsealed script, all uppercase letters. No word breaks, no punctuation. But anyway, there they are. They are numbered in fact in two ways. Originally they were given letters, A, B, C, D, and so on, and then after there were more than 26 of them, went into Greek, and then they were approximately in age order. And when Tischendorf discovered the Codex Sinaiticus, he went to Hebrew, so one of them, just the Codex Sinaiticus, has a Hebrew letter Aleph, which he thought that's because it's before A. The age isn't right. Anyway, then they said, well, we're going to run out of letters fairly soon, so they started numbering them, and the numbers begin with the 0. They also often have names. Later manuscripts, there's just so many of them, they couldn't give them all names, so they gave up trying. But you also find here that Codex D, actually there's two, they thought it was 2 volumes, but it turns out, people who studied the handwriting say it's written by 2 different people, so it's got 2 different numbers. EA means the E for the Gospels, which is in German for the Gospels being with an E, A for Acts, P for the Pauline epistles. So that there's a code for each one. So they still use the letters where they can, but often have to go on to numbers. A little bit later, the writing style changed again, and people started writing lowercase letters and putting breaks between the words, punctuation marks and accents in, and that's called a minuscule script, and the manuscripts are called minuscules after that writing style. They just have a number, that's minuscule 580, just got the number 580. And the last kind of manuscript is called a lectionary. That's a Bible written out with its content in the right order to follow a reading plan. So you could write a Christadelphian lectionary if you wanted to. You get an authorized version, of course, and you'd then write it out, divide it up into sections for the Bible reading planner. So instead of it going right the way through Genesis, it would do Genesis 1 and 2, and then it would do Psalms 1 and 2, and then it would do Matthew 1 and 2, and then it would go back and do Genesis 3 and 4, and so on. So that's lectionary. But because it was awkward, especially if you got an unsealed manuscript to start off with, it was difficult to turn your ordinary Bible into a lectionary. You have to have a table and keep on cross-referencing. They tended to copy those from other lectionaries, so they form an independent set of witnesses to the actual text itself. The only thing is that it doesn't give you any idea of the order, particularly as things like the Greek Orthodox Church has all sorts of weird and wonderful saints, and they have special readings that go in their days, so you don't just read through in a sort of logical order like our reading plan. But nonetheless, it's the same general idea. Well, the earliest manuscripts, the other one, the other kind of witness is what they call versions. These are translations of the New Testament into other languages. And in the 2nd century, there are already Latin versions, the old Latin versions. These translations made older than the oldest manuscripts we've got, or of any length anyway. There's translation to Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, Ethiopic. The Vulgate's a later Latin translation which became very popular. It's the best modern version you can come across, as far as I can see. Very good Latin and very clear. And you can use those again. They're copied separately by different people. The people who copied the Vulgate probably couldn't read Greek, so they wouldn't be able to cross-reference it. So you've got an independent witness yet again. So anyway, the earliest bits of the New Testament we've got are papyrus fragments from the 2nd century. They each only contain a few words. So P52, that's this one here, that's the Rylance fragment, that's down the road in the University of Manchester Library. They bring it out on special days and you can look at it. It doesn't look very exciting, it's sort of brown, about that big. But it contains part of John 18. So we know John 18 had to be written before that, and that's the first half very much of the 2nd century, possibly even into the 1st century. So it shows an early date for John's Gospel, in other words, not at the end of that century. This one's the so-called Jesus fragment, part of Matthew. Was a great fuss when it was dated as being part of the 1st century, and then the chap who dated it wrote a book where he pushed it even earlier forwards. It was written before this particular fragment, before 70 AD. I don't think so. The majority of scholars would say, well, it might be 2nd century, it's fairly late 2nd century. About 190 is its sort of mean date, with 20, 30 years either side of that. That's P90, that's middle of the 2nd century. It's only a little bit older than this one. And there are a fair number of those around. But what's more important are these. These are the big 6 papyri or papyri. Pauline epistles there, John. That one's Luke and John. And those are all from before 200 AD. Probably only about 190, but really before 200 AD. And there's another 3 that make up the big 6, which are written just after the turn of the century. So they're sort of the first half of the 3rd century, say 210, 220, that sort of date afterwards. So we got virtually the whole of the New Testament there from before 250 AD, if we want to look at it. So there's plenty of evidence for us to go at. Problem is that, of course, that you get little. You can see there that the edge is gone. This one's even worse. That's just one page of it, and so on. A bit's missing. So while we can see that substantially they're the same as the modern text. There's the old letter missing still. Not absolutely complete, but not bad. Well, the next set are the unsealed manuscripts. Let's go back over those. Because they were expensive, it wasn't until Constantine accommodated with the church that the church got the money from the state and could afford them. But we actually have a lot of unsealed manuscripts from quite an early time. That's the oldest one. That's the Codex Sinaiticus. It's got the complete New Testament and most of the Old Testament. There's a few Old Testament pages missing. And it dates from the first half of the 4th century. Probably just after 320 AD. 325 is the Council of Nicaea. At that, Constantine agreed to have a large number of copies made, pay for the copies to be made, and probably it's one of those. And well, I could keep on talking about unseals for a bit because there are hundreds of them, literally. And if we carry on for all the different New Testament manuscripts, there are 5,800 known manuscripts, so it's no good going over them all in detail. But there are a lot of them. What I have done, though, is plotted a graph which just shows how many there are. You can see that the sort of 2 populations. There's this early set, and then it all takes off. These are lectionaries here, the light blue there. They're minuscules, lectionaries. The minuscules take over from the unsealed, which take over from the papyri early on. The red gun's not working very well on that projector. Some of those are supposed to be red. Anyway, that's from Ehrman's database of 5,197 manuscripts. There's been a few hundred more discovered since he published that. The thing is that lots of these manuscripts are geographically remote. They were made in some monastery in the middle of the desert, or in the Alps, or out in the steppes of Russia, where they didn't have much contact with anyone else. There's a large amount of independent copying. So even quite a late manuscript can still be a very good witness. If it's copied from a very early manuscript and copied a long way from anywhere else, it can still be a very good witness to the text that we've got, independent. Now, that's not to say there aren't differences between the manuscripts. There are plenty of places where the different manuscripts have different texts. And the scribes who made the copies worked long hours. They could get very tired. They might work a 12-hour day. They might, in the winter, be still working a 12-hour day with gloves on and all the rest of it. One candle. So no electric lights. It might get quite dark. As they grow older, their eyesight fail. Like me, they have to wear glasses. Only there weren't any. They hadn't been invented. So they got worse at it. And in general, actually, they're pretty good copyists. The number of errors they made is a lot less than the number of errors I would make copying the same sort of thing out. But nonetheless, they did occasionally make mistakes. And there are variants in the text. You have to admit that happens. But in fact, the kind of mistakes they were likely to make are actually fairly obvious, and they tend to conform to known patterns. And I want to give you a look at an example so we can see what happens. So here we are. This is 1 John 2:23. Let's look it up. I've got the authorised version written out there, but that's no excuse. 1 John chapter 2 verse 23, and I want you to notice the italics. (1 John 2 verse 23, it says, whosoever denieth the Son, the same hath not the Father. And then in brackets, but he that acknowledgeth the Son hath the Father also. And that bit's in italics, just like I've written it up there. The fact it's in italics means that it's not part of the Greek text that the Authorised Version translators were working from. It's not in the Textus Receptus, the name of that text. It wasn't actually present in the Greek manuscripts available at the time of the translation. It was brought in from the Latin Vulgate. Everyone was convinced it ought to be there. Why were they convinced? Well, there are actually two variants in the different manuscripts we've got. There are enough manuscripts now for us to have every variant. If it's in somewhere, the real text is in the manuscripts we've got. So that's the full variant, and this one is the short variant here, and I've made a list of the manuscripts it's in. So that's a complete list of all the ones that don't have the full thing. There's the very early ones, Codex Syrianicus, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, Ephraemi Rescriptus, and so it goes. But not many. That's all the unsealed manuscripts going up to there. There's some minuscules, and then translations to Coptic, Latin, Syriac, and then quotations by two of the church fathers, Origen and Cyprian, who happened to quote that in books they wrote. The other side, if you look at that M there, means the majority of manuscripts. If you have a modern text, it'll put an M in, and that means everything else. And then it mentions one or two special ones that are early. One Latin translation of some manuscripts of the Vulgate and some manuscripts of Bohairic. But that's a lot more. Basically, there are many, many more manuscripts that support the short variation. But the older ones support the long one. So how do we decide between them? Well, even the people when they made the Authorised Version copy, they only had stuff that didn't have the short variant, but they still knew it ought to be there from the Vulgate. How? Well, if you look at the end of the line there, you'll see that's exactly the same words twice. Those words and those words are the same. Right? That's has the Father. That doesn't have the Father. Where are we? Has the Son and the Father. What happens is the scribe reads along, copying down that line, gets to those words, looks down at his manuscript, writes it down, and he looks back to where he got to, and he reaches these words instead. And he misses out what's in between. That's a common error. Copies make that kind of error a lot, and we know that happens, so we know which is the correct one. So, given the two alternatives, the long one is almost certainly the correct one. And the Authorised Version translators work that out, and it's there in the Authorised Version. They put it in italics because it's not in the Greek text, but nonetheless, it's there. And that's actually an error that's so common. It's got a name. It's called a homeoteliton. Homeo, Greek, same. Telos means ends. It's the same ending. Teleton is an ending. It's the same ending. It's a place where the text left out because the line ends the same words as an earlier portion. And you can spot those, and you can knock all those out, and you're retrieving the original text. Not that there's many differences anyway, or not that there's much in the way significant differences, but one can be certain what the correct reading is by looking at these common copying errors. So the process of working through variants and seeking out the best variant was used by scholars to produce the texts from which our modern translations are made. The first one was those that was produced in 1516. I've written 1515 up there. It should be 1516 by a chap called Erasmus. He was only working from a small number of manuscripts. It was published by a chap called Robert Etienne, who put verses in for the first time. It wasn't called the Textus Receptus, the received text. And it's the basis of all the Tudor English Bibles. Tyndale used it, the Authorised Version people used it as well. But there are issues with the Textus Receptus. It was produced from only 6 manuscripts. None of them covered the whole of the New Testament. In fact, there was one little bit of the New Testament wasn't covered by any of them. The last pages of the Revelation were lost from one of the manuscript, the only manuscript that covered that bit, and he had to translate those back in from the Vulgate. Nonetheless, it's actually very, very good. You can see how good it is when you read the authorized version. It's a very good translation. Anyway, in the 19th century, various scholars tried to improve the text. They discovered additional manuscripts and they tried to classify them. And they produced a theory that there were actually 3 or perhaps 4 main centres of copying, each one with its own text. And those were, the places were Rome, which they said produced the colour text from that, the Western text. That's the text that underlines these old Latin translations, and only occasionally a couple of unsealed manuscripts, but not much else. There's Constantinople, which gave rise to the Byzantine text. That's the most common one. First of all, they spoke Greek in Byzantium, so they wanted Greek Bibles, not Latin Bibles. And secondly, they were very rich, so they could afford to produce lots of copies. In Alexandria, supposed to produce the Alexandrian text, and they argue that maybe there's a text from Caesarea, or maybe there isn't. No one's absolutely certain about it. And in the 19th century, most of the known early manuscripts were considered to be Alexandrian, and the late ones were classified as Byzantine. So they decided the Alexandrian text was the closest to the original. Since then, we've discovered a lot more early manuscripts that happen to be Byzantine in character. But in fact, there's a lot more very, very recent research. Let's show you a bit of it. Says that they don't cluster at all. That's a plot, never mind what the scale is, of different manuscripts and characteristics of the text. And it ought to cluster together in 3 clusters: a Western cluster, a Byzantine cluster, and an Alexandrian cluster, and possibly a Caesarean one. But in fact, it doesn't. They just dot it around. There aren't these divisions to the text. Don't in fact exist at all, which rather undermines a lot of the work that these 19th century critics were doing, trying to produce a different text. Anyway, the various texts were published in the 19th century. The most respected of those was by a chap called Nessel. There he is, Eberhard Nessel on the bottom left there, and it was taken up by a chap called Kurt Aland in the 20th century, and is still the one which is mostly used. It's now its 27th edition. The most radical of them was published in 1881 by 2 characters called Westcott and Hort. One of them was the Bishop of Durham. Westcott was the Bishop of Durham. Hort was a scholar from Oxford. Bishops of Durham seem to cause trouble wherever they go, especially Durham, I suppose. It formed the basis of the 1881 revised version, and it had a really big influence on other modern texts. And a lot of the modern translations, you can trace variants back to Westcott and Hort. Now, the text that Nessel and Aland developed was revised and developed and revised and developed. In 1961, it was fairly well fixed as the best available Greek text of the New Testament, and that text was adopted by the United Bible Societies. It's known as the UBS text, United Bible Society text, and late editions of that, or of the Nessel-Aland text, only differ in the list of variants that are written in the margin. It doesn't differ in the text itself. That's fixed. And nowadays, this is becoming a sort of new textus receptus. Most modern translations are translated from that Greek New Testament there. Now, the important questions are how certain the text of the New Testament is, and how wide is the extent of the variation. The United Bible Society's help there. They give a rating to each place in the text where the variation occurs. Oh, that's a list showing that inside that book you've got the text in Greek, and then you've got, so this is the 1 Peter, and you can see a couple of variants there. The first one, it's a list of places. If you turn to the first chapter of 1 Peter, just have a look at what we've got, just to give you a flavour. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 1. and it says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And then here you've got the first one says that maybe it should be Pontus and Galatia, Cappadocia, and Asia and Bithynia. Next one says maybe, no, actually it's got an and all the way through, and Asia and Bithynia there, no ands at all here. And then the standard one that we've got with all these manuscripts following it. Now, it's not exactly a major variant. It doesn't change belief very much to think that there might be more than one and in that list. And it's only a small number of manuscripts that have extra ands here and there in different places, depending on which manuscripts. But you end up with tables like that that tell you what's going on. Anyway, what happens is that the UBS people have divided them up into categories. A means absolutely certain, no doubt about it in any way. D means there's a bit of doubt. And that's the percentages. They've changed as more manuscripts have been discovered. The percentages have changed slightly, but nonetheless they're fairly stable. I think they've got slightly less certain as time's gone on about what's actually happening. It still looks like a lot of variation compared to what's there, because it only looks at places where there's a variation. Most of the text doesn't have a variation at all, and in that case, of course, we're absolutely completely certain what the text is, because we've got so many manuscripts that don't give a variation. So what I did was I counted up the words in the Greek New Testament. Well, I got a computer to do it for me, and then counted up the words in the variants that are uncertain. And there are 138,020 words in the Greek New Testament, give or take, and I count 912 words that are considered to be uncertain. So there you are. That's the yellow bar is the whole of the New Testament, and the blue bit at the end shows the bit that's uncertain. Now, even so, that's overestimating the problem, because what I then did was to categorise the variants into 5 categories. I carried them 0 to 4, and that's the number of words. Of course, there are a lot more variants that are very, very minor, because they're only a letter or so, whereas there are 2 narratives of some length. So the first category, category 0, I'm not going to give an example because you wouldn't notice it. They're examples that don't appear in translation. They're matters of Greek style. There may be an article that appears, or maybe the words are coming in a different order, but in Greek the order of the words is completely unimportant, because it's the word ending that determines what it means in terms of what we would use as for position in sentence. So in translation you wouldn't notice those at all. It wouldn't be possible to translate those variations. Category 1 variants are very minor. Let's look in the Gospel of Matthew. There's one there, Matthew 20 and verse 17. There's only 68 words like this in the whole New Testament. Matthew 20, verse 17. And Jesus, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples apart in the way and said unto them. Right? Now, it's not certain whether that word disciples is there. It might be, and Jesus, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 apart in the way and said unto them. Now, like I said, it's not a very major variation. It doesn't make any difference at all to the narrative in any way. It's just whether they're called the 12 or the 12 disciples. Like I said, there are 68 words that are like that. Not certain, but don't make any difference. Minor changes to meaning. Category 2. Matthew 27, verse 16. That's this is 2 words worth. Actually, it's 4 words worth of it. Matthew 27, verse 16, but 2 places within this little bit. Matthew 27 verse 16, and they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Wherefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said to them, Whom will you that I release unto you, Barabbas, or Jesus, which is called Christ? And some manuscripts don't call him Barabbas, they call him Jesus Barabbas. And it's not clear whether there are not very many manuscripts that have Jesus Barabbas, but you can think a lot of scribes might not like the thought that Barabbas had the same forename as Jesus. And so they might cut it out. Again, it's got some effect on the meaning, but not a big one. Doesn't change the narrative in any way, let alone one's beliefs. Robbery's still got the name Barabbas, he still gets released, and Jesus takes his cross. Category 3 variants, similar significance, but have phrases of several words. It's a big one here, one of the more major ones, Matthew 21. But the number of words by now is getting quite long, quite a lot. It looks like quite a lot for only a small number of variants because there are several words to a variant. Matthew 21 verse 44. In this gospel only, not in parallel text. It says, Whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. The words, it will grind him, on whosoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder, might not be there. They're uncertain. They're category D in the UBS version. And there are about 5 or 6 places where that sort of scale of problem happens. And the last 2 are narratives of some length. And in fact there are 2 of those. One is the end of Mark's Gospel, that's 12 verses, and the other one is the account of the woman taken in adultery. We read the woman taken in adultery at the beginning of the meeting. So it's a simpler problem to tackle. So let's have a quick look at it. It's missing from the oldest manuscripts. These are the witnesses here. So it's present in the majority of texts, nearly everything. The old Latin translations, some of the Coptic ones, and D and Jerome quotes from it. It exists in these manuscripts, but it's marked with something that says they're not sure. These manuscripts have it, but don't have it in the same place. They have it somewhere else. In Luke's Gospel is a favourite spot for it. Some have it between Luke and John. These manuscripts don't have it at all, and these manuscripts don't have it, but have a mark that says there should be something there. I think I've got pictures of those 2. So if you look there, and well, I've got a thing, there it is. There's a little blob, which is the nearest you get to punctuation in an unsealed manuscript, which says there's something that ought to be there, but we're not including it. So that's the account of the woman taken in adultery. Now, the thing about that is it's almost certainly authentic. Everyone agrees it's authentic. It clearly is authentic. You can't really believe that someone would invent that and get it into the Bible and no one would complain. You could imagine, though, some monk stuck in the Egyptian desert saying, "Ooh, I don't know if I want to have that read out to my congregation. I shall miss it out when I do my copy." And that's probably what happened. Like I said, most manuscripts have it in, and it's very difficult to believe that, including the early Roman ones, the early Latin ones. So the oldest witnesses, they're not the oldest manuscripts, but the oldest witnesses also have it in. So almost certainly it's authentic. And everyone agrees it's probably authentic. But on manuscript evidence, it's very difficult to prove it absolutely. So the other one's the end of Mark. And again, if you look at it, it's omitted in 4 witnesses, Armenian being a witness. There's a short ending which happens in one Latin manuscript. It appears also in quite a few unsealed manuscripts, but that's a lectionary there. But it's there in the margin with the ordinary ending there as well. And then the long ending appears in a whole load of them, including the majority, the Vulgate, the Old Latin translations. And there it is marked with something odd about this in a few other manuscripts. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the overwhelming number of manuscripts, and the earliest ones, imply that therefore it should be there. But you'll find that it's marked as not being there. That's Codex Sinaiticus, that's Aleph. There's where it ought to be, but it's left blank. So they knew it existed, they left space for it, but no one's written it in. And the same thing with the Codex Vaticanus, it would be there and it would go over the page onto the next one. I couldn't find a picture of the next page. Anyway, if it's just a blank page, who knows what it could be, anything. Really, it's probably authentic. In fact, it doesn't matter very much, because there's nothing you can't get there that's from another gospel as well. Mark's gospel contains incidents that are recorded in other gospels, sayings that are recorded in other gospels, so we don't lose anything. It's a slightly confused picture. Like I said, I think that the standard ending of Mark in the authorised version is part of the original text, but there's sufficient doubt for me to be unhappy using it, say, in a lecture where you've got interested friends who might say, hang on, it's doing from something that's doubtful. I don't think it's very doubtful, but I might not use it nonetheless for preaching from. Exhortation is different. So, let's have a look at very quickly look at two other things. Well, one other if we run out of time. This is the famous 1 John 5 verses 7 and 8. Well, it's verse 7 really. If you've got an authorised version, it's in. If you've got a later version, it's not in. Unless you've got a New King James, which has it there with little notes saying it's not in some manuscripts, which is rather an understatement. It's not in any manuscripts. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 7. It's well known, I think, to Christadelphians, or it was, but nowadays people are so little interested in the Trinity outside they tend not to quote it anymore. But just in case it ever crops up again, here we are. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 7. There are these three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And that was quoted a lot by, the first few words as well, of the next verse. That was quoted a lot by Trinitarians a long time ago. But in fact, it's something that isn't really there. There's Erasmus's first edition, and it wasn't in that. What happened is that Erasmus knew it shouldn't be there. It was in the Vulgate, but he knew it shouldn't be there. And he was so convinced, he said, if anyone can find a Greek manuscript with it in, then I'll put it in. Sort of wager. Well, there weren't any, he knew that. But there was one being written, actually being copied. He said the first printed Greek New Testament he's producing. So everything's a manuscript up to that point. They were still making manuscripts. They were making one. It's called the Codex Britannicus, and it's got a number. Well, let's go back again. It's got a number, which I got written down, number minuscule 61, and the copying was then hurried up. They got to the middle of Hebrews, and you can see, if you get the Codex Britannicus or get pictures of it, you can see where they suddenly said, we've got to get this finished quickly, because the handwriting goes to pot. And they rush along, writing faster and faster and faster, and there it is with the text in 1 John. And Erasmus, trapped by his own wager, was forced to include in his third edition. That's the edition that went to the publishers as the Textus Receptus, and it got from there into the authorised version. So there's the first bit, which is bad enough, but you can look at it from all sorts of other ways. First of all, linguistic fossils. If you look at it, it shows every sign of not having been composed in Greek. The rest of John's letter was written in Greek, but that particular line was written in Latin. It lacks all the articles that ought to be there. Second thing is that if you get it from a Latin edition, the only other place you can get it from, it says these three are one in Christ Jesus. It's different. It's only got the one witness, which is this Codex Britannicus. And if you look at the quotations, also an argument about the Trinity going on for centuries, around the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, and they never ever quoted it, which you'd expect them to do if it was they were arguing about the Trinity, which they were. This would be an absolutely important verse, but they never quoted it. So we can be pretty certain that it isn't part of the original text. Actually, it first comes from Spain. A chap called Priscillian produced it in a commentary, and it gradually grew in from there. I've got one other one. Let's give time before I finish off. This is one which appears in modern versions. This is the new equivalent of the Comma Johanneum, the one that we just looked at, the 1 John 5 verse 7. John 1 verse 18. Now, has any brother got a modern translation? An NASB or an NIV or a right? In that case, I shall ask Andrew Norcross, because he's just borrowed one. Not his, that's why. So, John 1 verse 18.
No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him.
Right, thanks. So there you go. There are actually 5 variants there. There's only begotten Son, which is what the authorised version has. There's the only begotten Son, which is the same but with one extra letter that says the only begotten God and the only begotten God. I just put those together because there's not much difference. And only begotten Son of God, which is quoted by a 2nd century chap writing a commentary, which may have been doing it from memory, so he may have got it wrong. So really between these 2 main variants here, and you can see the list. The only begotten Son is just about everything. There's the one that means all of them. Early Latin translations, Syriac, Coptic, 3 early church fathers, some very prestigious manuscripts there, but the earliest 4 manuscripts, these ones here, have only begotten God. That translation's older. Well, that translations are before these manuscripts, but nonetheless the oldest 4 manuscripts and 3 other ones have only begotten God. Just the 7 manuscripts, out of all the different other manuscripts, only 7 have it, have God, and they have 2 different variants. So think about what's going on. First of all, how would that, what you do is you say, what variant would explain all the others? It's a bit hard to say that in this case, because when they write the word Jesus or the word God, they abbreviated it. And the first letter would be a U, it's huios, and there's no H in Greek, so it's an accent. And they put the first and the last letter on a line over the top. So Son would be huios, and God would be theos, which would be a theta, and a sigma, same ending letter. And the 2, a theta and an upsilon in that script, look fairly similar, so it'd be easy to make the mistake and go from one to the other. So it's only a 1-letter change, in fact. Still quite an important one. Next thing is that these 4 manuscripts, these 2 being on papyri, the only papyri that survived are the ones in Egypt. It's too wet for papyrus anywhere else, and they gradually fell to bits. Aleph Codex Sinaiticus comes from Egypt. B Codex Vaticanus comes from Egypt. So it's very geographical. We don't know where C came from, or L. 33 is a copy of something much earlier, probably though an Egyptian manuscript. So they're very, very geographically located. If there's one mistake made by some copyists in Egypt, then that might go into the manuscripts in Egypt. Third one, actually the earliest witnesses aren't those manuscripts, it's the Latin translations. So the earliest text we have says the Son, not God. And finally, the sense of the passage, it doesn't make much sense to say no one has seen God at any time, but God has declared him or revealed him. Because if no one's seen God at any time, it doesn't answer the problem. So he's talking about how God is revealed. But to say that no one's seen God at any time, but the Son has revealed him, makes sense. So really, it's almost certain that the authorised version is correct and the modern versions aren't correct. What you've got is a sign of the Trinitarian leanings of the people who produce modern translations. Anyway, let's summarise where we're at. First of all, think about the scale of the evidence we've got. There are about 5,800 known Greek manuscripts There are about 6,000 Latin manuscripts. There are a whole load of other ones in Coptic, Syriac, ancient Slavonic, Armenian, you name it, any language you can think of it. There are lots of manuscripts of the Bible in it. So we've got thousands of manuscripts, and they all give you a very, very similar text. Secondly, the earliest full witnesses give you the full text from about 200 AD, slightly before. There are lots and lots of manuscripts once you get to the 300s and onwards. And the other thing that I haven't really talked about is where people wrote books and quoted from the Bible, and they wrote it out. Those are citations, patristic citations from the early church fathers. And we could actually reconstruct the whole New Testament from those if we wanted to. It'd be hard, because the order wouldn't be there, but unless you could do it. There's enough text, each of it's quoted several times. So, even if we lost all the manuscripts, we could, that would cause the cost of some work together from the citations. So there are lots of manuscripts, they're early, and not only that, they're independent. The critics said, well, no, there are only 3 or maybe 4 different texts. Actually, there aren't. There are lots of different texts. That's what people are beginning to realise. Secondly, the scale of variation. I did it in words before. Here it is in lines. There are 15,000 lines of the Greek New Testament. Fewer than 100 lines. There's not any doubt about them. Not very much. Not only that, 2/3 of that variation is actually pretty minor. Doesn't make any difference to the reader. And what's left is the woman taking adultery in the ending of Mark. They're probably there anyway, but nothing there to change one's beliefs. Then the other one, the one that I haven't really raised, is the idea of how radical a variation can you get. Well, the most radical variation, one end you've got a really super Byzantine, as it were, text. That's the one the authorised version goes from. The other extreme is the Westcott and Hort text. It tries to be as different as it can from the standard text the authorised version came from. Now, if you've got an interlinear revised version, authorised version, quite a lot of them around in Christadelphian community, then probably you won't really notice the differences in the text unless the different translation will the difference in the text. That's the most radical difference you can get between different texts of the Bible, and it isn't very great. They are in fact very, very similar translations. You can be pretty confident about the text of the New Testament. Things like the UBS text, a very good text. It finds 1 or 2 mistakes in the Textus Receptus, but it tends to be too radical and have gone too far away from the sort of traditional text, I think, the modern ones. I suspect that there's now going to be some kind of slight reaction if people actually get around to producing more Bibles, then maybe the text will tend back towards the authorised version again. And the last thing is, it's not the only evidence. We've looked at manuscript evidence, but of course there's evidence of archaeology, undesigned scriptural evidences, linguistic fossils, tiny details in the text which you can see are backed up by other evidence. Now, if the manuscript copying was bad, those details would go. It wouldn't match the archaeology. You wouldn't be able to find undesigned coincidences. Linguistic fossils would disappear. They're there. That shows that the text is accurate, and that everything is there that should be. Basically, you can trust the text of the New Testament.